Hey, good morning, guys and girls, and happy Thursday. Looks like a beautiful day beginning to shine out there. I hope you guys are doing well and staying well and healthy and not getting any of this junk that we're talking so much about. So, today we're going to kind of wind down the rest of our study on the Civil War by talking about four crucial turning points when, if they had gone different ways, this war would have turned out totally and completely differently. Historians have long said that great big wheels turn on very small axles. And that was never more true than in the Civil War, where decisions made by the leaders resulted oftentimes in opportunities being lost and the war extended further than it should have been. So I want to talk about four of those today, and they all are connected to key Civil War battles. First of all, the first battle we talk about in the Civil War, outside of the attacking of Fort Sumter, of course, is the first Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Manassas, as it is called, different parts of the country. As you remember, we taught in class that this battle was fought about 30 miles outside of Washington, D.C. The Union Army was in their beautiful blue uniforms, and it was a wonderful parade, and all of the citizens in and around D.C. jumped in their horses and carriages, and they rode out to the battlefield to watch this well-prepared, well-organized Union Army just wipe the field up with the Confederates. The only problem was it didn't turn out that way at all. When the war began, when the battle began, rather, the Union soldiers fell into total disarray, and they began to flee the battlefield. It was considered a full and total rout, which means that they ran off the battlefield out of control, running back towards Washington as fast as they could. And of course, the Confederate Army had proven that they were up to the task of fighting and at least staying in this war for a significant period of time. So here's the question. What if Beauregard, who was the Confederate general, had decided to pursue the Union Army when they began to retreat rapidly back to Washington, D.C.? Even though vastly outnumbered and his army was a little bit ragtag, had Beauregard followed the army into D.C., chasing them in their retreat, total disarray, total disorder, it is entirely possible the war could have ended at that very point, because Washington would have been captured, the capital, and the Union Army would have probably fallen apart, and it is possible that the North may have sued for peace at that point. We really don't know, because of course Beauregard did not do that. The second key issue, or second key point, crucial point, occurred around the Battle of Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg, depending upon which side of the war you were on. And the key there was that in September of 1862, the two armies met near a little creek called Antietam Creek. Robert E. Lee had put a lot of time and strategy into preparing for this battle, and he had written the battle plans down and the orders for troop movement on a piece of paper, wrapped them in 3 cigars, tied them up, handed them to a courier to go to the different sections of the army to let them know what they were supposed to do. Somewhere along the way, the courier lost the orders wrapped around the cigars, special orders number 62, and they were lost somewhere in transit. And in a few days, a Union soldier just simply walking through the area looked down, and what caught his eye were the cigars. Cigars were hard to come by, and so he felt like he had just hit the lucky streak, because he had 3 cigars, and that was not very common. He paid little regard to the piece of paper they were wrapped in until he opened them up and saw Robert E. Lee's signature. Those orders were then given to the commander on the battlefield, Ambrose Burnside, the Union commander who knew all of Lee's troop movement and was able to win a decisive victory at Antietam on September 17th of 1862. And by the way, that is known as the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 28,000 casualties, killed and wounded, on both sides that day. The bloodiest day in American warfare. September 17th, 1862. So we come to the third what if. Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was a battle fought in Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee and his best team general, Stonewall Jackson, had put together a plan to face Joe Hooker's army in Chancellorsville. Hooker had separated his troops and he had placed them at different angles, and Robert E. Lee, who was badly outmanned, as he was the entire war, put together the most successful, amazing, brilliant battle plan that military history has shown. It's still studied today in military colleges. He divided his troops, already outnumbered. Very few generals ever would have done that. But Robert E. Lee was not above trying things that were kind of outside the box of thinking when it came to military strategy. So he kept the smallest part of his army facing Hooker and moved around enough to make Hooker think that he was preparing to attack from that angle. Stonewall Jackson took the largest piece of the Confederate Army and went around Hooker's right flank, and at about sunset in May of 1863, I think it was May 6th of 1863, he launched an attack on the right flank of Meade's army and won a crushing defeat, ran Hooker's army off the battlefield, and won a great victory. And it is still today considered to be one of the greatest military strategic victories in the history of American warfare. But it was a costly victory. As Jackson was riding back into his camp after dark, his troops, mistakenly thinking he was part of a Union brigade, fired on Jackson. He was hit in the arm, left arm. His arm had to be amputated, and a few days later he succumbed to pneumonia, and Lee lost his most successful, his most trusted general in the Civil War. In fact, his statement was that Jackson has lost his left arm, but I've lost my right arm. Lee's army was never quite the same after the loss of Stonewall Jackson. So what if Jackson had not been wounded? What if he had survived and was part of the strategy of the next huge battle, which was in July in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? We will never know exactly what would have happened had Jackson lived and been closely advising Lee during the Gettysburg battle, which was crucial, which was a massive defeat for the Confederacy. And Lee took some unusual risks in the Gettysburg battle, including the ill-fated Pickett's Charge on July 3rd of 1863. And that brings us to the last of what I would call the final crucial turning points in the Civil War. As you remember our study about Gettysburg, and some of you did projects on Gettysburg, you remember that this battle began on July 1st of 1863 with a Confederate victory of sorts, although within that victory, Jubal Early did not follow the advice of Robert E. Lee and tried to complete the attack of Culp's Hill, which was on the western side of Gettysburg, and instead felt it was best to back off and just accept what victory they had. The second day of the battle, as you recall, was fought in and around Little Round Top, the Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and in that battle, it really came out to be a draw. Neither side got a real advantage. And the only thing that came out of this was that the Union Army became firmly entrenched on Cemetery Ridge, which is the higher position facing the field across which the next day's battle would be fought. On July 3rd of 1863, Robert E. Lee had put together a plan to spend about 3 hours just simply bombing the dickens out of the Northern Army up on Cemetery Ridge. And so the most massive artillery campaign in the history of American warfare began on July 3rd of 1863 at about 10 in the morning. And cannons fired time after time for 3 solid hours, launching artillery over into, they thought, the Union Army. What the artillery commanders could not know was that they were overshooting the target, and the artillery was exploding far behind the northern lines on the top of Cemetery Ridge. And of course, this did nothing to soften the military on Cemetery Ridge, and so it did not give the Southern Army any advantage as they began to prepare a charge. Lee had planned for a brigade under George Pickett, General George Pickett, to march across a mile-long open field between Seminary Ridge, which was on the south side of the battlefield towards Cemetery Ridge on the north side of the battlefield. And Cemetery Ridge was about probably 75 to 80 feet higher in elevation than Seminary Ridge. You have to watch those terms, they'll get confusing. So at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, against the advice of all of his commanders, Lee sent several thousand, tens of thousands of men across that battlefield. They were literally massacred. At one point, they actually broke through the Union lines just briefly. That's considered the high point of the Civil War for Lee. But overall, the Southern Army experienced a crushing defeat at Gettysburg. As darkness fell, Lee began to prepare his retreat, and he slipped out of town early on the morning of July 4th. The rivers, he was crossing the Potomac, and the Potomac River was swollen from recent rains, and he was trapped with Gettysburg to his back and the Potomac River to his front. The Union commander, George Meade, could have chased him, could have pursued him, should have pursued him. He did not pursue him. In fact, he allowed Lee to sit on the Potomac River for 3 days, waiting to cross, and then slip back into Southern Territory. And the Confederate armies would never cross into Northern Territory again. So what would have happened had Meade pursued Lee instead of letting him cross the Potomac River? The war would have probably ended right there. Lee's army would have almost had to have surrendered, and the war would have ended. In fact, at several points along the way, the war could have ended had decisions been made, opportunities wasted that allowed the armies to escape. Bull Run at the beginning, Gettysburg near the middle, and then there were other situations down the road. But ultimately, the turning point of the war was Gettysburg. The Union Army was continuing to pursue the Confederate Army all through Virginia into North Carolina until the war finally ended on April 9th of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in the home of William McLean. Those are 4 crucial turning points in the history of the Civil War. Now, you should be listening. I hope you've been listening. And so take the next few minutes and answer the questions below, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.